So thank you, everyone. Welcome. I get very excited when I do in-person events now because it's still quite novel to me. Yeah. So, but I just want to say welcome to everyone. My name is Helen Kelisky. I'm a board member of Women in Telco and Technology, which has been going for more than 20 years now. And I'm managing director of Google Cloud for UK and Ireland, a role I have been in for the last 3 months. So I am still officially a Noogler, not a doogler. No, I'm not a dog, not a Googler. And if I had a dog, it would be a doogler. Anyway, just so that you know this, I'm trying to get into the lingo here. So I'd like to welcome you here to our hybrid WiTT event. So we're trying these out and see how they go. So bear with us. And this is on cybersecurity and cybersafety, risks and solutions. Something very close to the heart of Google, my employer. So, and I think it should be a very interesting event. So let me just give a bit of background. In 2017, there were 60 serious cyber attacks each month, according to the National Cybersecurity Centre, the NCSC, I will refer to it as. At the start of 2022, an NCSC report stated that 39% of businesses and 26% of charities reported breaches in 2021, and that the NCSC had taken down 2.3 million malicious campaigns. So you can see the growth of cyber threats is exponential. So today, attacks are more common, they are more sophisticated, and they are more targeted. Online risks to our children have also increased. The Internet Watch Foundation, the IWF, is concerned that moving our lives online during the pandemic has put children, mainly girls, at greater risk of exploitation. And actually, this is something very close to my heart because a friend of mine has a daughter that's been badly affected by this. In 2021, IWF investigated 360,000 reports of suspected criminal material, more than they dealt with over the entire 15 years previous of their existence. So what should we be expecting and what should we be witnessing in 2022? New threats to guard against. What part does legislation play? How will it protect children online? This is a huge subject and all the more topical as we emerge from, one, the pandemic, and given the fact that the online safety bill is making its way through Parliament. And apparently this legislation will be the most far-reaching globally as in terms of protecting people from online attacks. But I'm pleased to say, so this is a huge subject. I'm pleased to say I have experts joining me today to basically discuss it and impart their knowledge. I will introduce each one of these illustrious speakers, then ask each of them to invite them to basically introduce us into their world for 5 to 10 minutes, and then I will open it up for questions. So I'm just going to check that we've got our first speaker. If we haven't got our first speaker, I will go to our next speaker. Right, we haven't got our first speaker. So our first speaker was due to be a lady called Eleanor Fairford. She is Deputy Director of Incident Management at the NCSC, which launched in 2016, which is part of GCHQ. Oh my goodness, the timing of that is just awesome. So do we have Eleanor? So in terms of the NCSC, they launched in 2016. They are part of GCHQ, and they are helping make the UK the safest place to live and work online. That is their mission.
Hi there, can you hear me now?
I can, and I have just introduced you, but hang on a second. So we'll hear from Eleanor first, beautiful timing, and she will talk about her work at the NCSC. As Deputy Director for Incident Management. Then we'll hear from Jenna, who is here and hosting us. So thank you very much, Jenna, to Jenna and Bird. And just interestingly, Jenna is quite new and she is a birdie. Don't you love that? I love that. I love that. And she is Legal Director of Privacy and Data Protection at Bird. And she will talk about security breaches and liability under the wider guise of GDPR. Yeah. Then we'll hear from Flick March. She is country practice leader at Kyndryl for security and resilience, and will tell us about what businesses are doing today to equip themselves and how she helps them recover after an attack, because that's also the other side of the equation. And then finally, we'll hear from Sharon Pursey, OBE and CEO at the SafeToNet Foundation and co-founder and head of strategic alliances at SafeToNet Limited. Hopefully I got that all right, Sharon. And supporting projects to keep children safe online. So something very dear to all our hearts, I'm sure. Anyway, without further ado, I will hand over to, sorry. So if you guys present for 5 to 10 minutes, and then I will open up to questions. Okay, so get ready. Right, Eleanor, over to you. Welcome.
Thank you, Helen, for that introduction, and thank you for the opportunity to join you virtually today. And apologies, I can't be with you in person, but it's great to have the opportunity to speak with you. So I thought I would talk through the different cyber threats that we in the National Cybersecurity Centre deal with on a day-to-day basis and that constitute the cyber threat landscape. So this is the malicious cyber activity seeking to harm the UK. And the NCSC exists to try and make the UK a safe place to live and work online, so to reduce that harm as far as possible. So what I can just talk through is some of the different threats that we see attacking the UK, what it is that we're trying to defend against, and then hand over to colleagues on the panel to talk through some of the implications of those threats. So I thought I would just start off by talking about the different types of cyber threats that we see. I'll look at the difference between state activity, cyber crime, and then I'll do a bit of a deep dive briefly into ransomware, which is one of the big cyber threats that we're really worried about at the moment. So in terms of the inbound activity, hitting the UK, targeting UK organisations, so large organisations, small organisations, government, private sector, all organisations and all sectors are really vulnerable to the cyber threats that we face. And what I would describe, so at the very top end, at the most acute pinnacle of the cyber threat, those who are the most sophisticated actors that can conduct the most harm against us are those that we describe as APTs, so advanced persistent threat actors. And APTs usually refers to other states. And this is where it gets geopolitical. So in terms of these inbound activities, what we see is it's quite a small amount of the overall percentage, but these are the really worrisome cyber activities that are conducted at the hands of very sophisticated actors. So generally speaking, from the NCSC point of view, we're talking about states with particularly sophisticated cyber apparatus like Russia and China, who are able to really cause an awful lot of damage. And you'll recall from recent years, we've really gone into detail and we've exposed a lot of the Russian and Chinese cyber activity that has targeted the UK. So this is the kind of top end of the cyber threat that the UK faces. These are attacks that are often about stealing secrets, conducting espionage, or even more damagingly are about disrupting UK services and things that genuinely impact on the UK way of life. So things like the WannaCry attack back in 2016 was a huge cyber attack that really impacted on the NHS, as you will remember, and took out all of the NHS systems, in which we actually latterly attributed to North Korean state-sponsored actors who were seeking to sort of carry out massive disruption across the globe, which of course they achieved, including potentially a lot of NHS networks as well. And then in 2017, we saw NotPetya. So this was another enormous global cyber attack. It looked like ransomware. It was kind of masquerading in that way, but basically it was designed to disrupt organizations across the globe, but particularly focusing on Ukrainian financial and government institutions. But then it spread onwards and was indiscriminate and took out global organizations, as you'll have seen, and really caused massive damage. And that one we subsequently attributed to Russian state-sponsored actors as well. So we see these state-sponsored attacks as the real pinnacle of the kind of disruption and taking out vital services that are really important to the UK. But they also operate kind of covertly behind the scenes to like steal secrets and kind of prowl around in networks and kind of be more subtle. And we saw some examples of the really subtle stuff when they did the SolarWinds attack of sort of 18 months ago, 2 years ago, where again, it was Russian actors who managed to get onto government networks across the globe, but particularly in the US and elsewhere. And they just sort of hoovered up government information from those networks. And it was a really sophisticated attack that it took the US, as you'll recall, months and months of recovery to get through. And this was a really good example of the sort of state-sponsored cyber espionage. So if back in the day, to do spying, you had to go and sit on a bench somewhere and speak into your lapel and hand over a briefcase. These days, you can crack into somebody's network and you can just hoover it all up. So it's a very effective way of doing mass targeting, and cyber is a tool that is commonly used for that sort of activity. So we see that happening, but it is the very tip of the iceberg. It's the worst kind of threat that we face. But in terms of day-to-day lives and the impact on people and the sort of services that they access and what they do, it's cyber crime that really poses the greatest threat. It's a far vaster landscape, and we have criminal groups kind of rampaging around, conducting fraud, and managing to really disrupt the lives of individuals and citizens, just trying to do day-to-day business, and of course taking out small and medium-sized enterprises who are falling victim to ransomware attacks and to crime on a daily basis. So this for us is the huge kind of remainder of the iceberg. This is the massive chronic ongoing threat. Kind of 90% of the threat landscape is this kind of criminal activity. It's financially motivated. A lot of it also comes from Russia, but from crime groups based in Russia or the states nearby to Russia. And it's really designed to get money, to conduct fraud, and to have an impact, a direct impact on people's lives. So the most obvious one at the moment is ransomware, and ransomware is a huge issue for NCSC and for like the cybersecurity community. Ransomware is super effective, so you can detonate a ransomware attack quite easily on a victim's network. You can encrypt all of their files, all of their information. You can make it impossible for them to do day-to-day business, and then you send them a ransom demand that says we will only give you the key to decrypt your files if you pay a certain amount. They will extort a ransom from you in order to be able to decrypt your files. And this is a common MO these days. And it's even kind of evolved of late, where they will do that, and they will also copy your data. They will go into your files, they will take all of your data, and the ransom is extorted in order to give you the key and to return that data. So if you do not pay the ransom, your data gets leaked online, often onto the dark web. So you have this double extortion now taking place, and there are hundreds, if not thousands, of organizations falling victim to this every day, and finding themselves unable to continue with day-to-day business. The ones that we're really worried about in the NCSC are the ones that impact on citizens' services and day-to-day life. So ones where, for instance, we've seen councils taken out by ransomware, and it has had an impact on day-to-day services of people trying to pay their bills, people trying to buy houses when the land registry files were all deleted and encrypted, people trying to secure school places for their children. These are the kinds of day-to-day activities that are jeopardized by this kind of criminal activity. So I think what I would say in kind of summing up is that although we worry a lot about the APT state threat, and the APT state threat is definitely something to worry about, when it comes to things that people day to day might experience and might fall foul of, be that council services that have been disrupted by ransomware, be that, Joe blogs trying to do stuff online and falling victim to phishing attacks and credit card theft and all the other things that take place that are an enormous amount of criminal activity. In kind of the grand scheme of things, it's that cyber crime that is that really pernicious threat that undermines people's confidence in what they can do online and that really has an impact on people's lives. So those are the two threats that I wanted to kind of call out, and I hope that's a bit of a useful threat landscape backdrop for the rest of the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Eleanor. Wow, my goodness. And we'll come back to that with questions, I'm sure. Right, but now I'm going to hand over to Jenna, who's going to take more of a business lens and more of a legislative lens with GDPR. Jenna, over to you.
Hi, good evening, everybody. For those in the room, those on the phone, just wanted to really talk about cybersecurity, but from the perspective of personal data. So to the extent that GDPR applies and other regulations, and I've just listed a few of these, and I'm happy to share these slides, by the way, afterwards, if it's any use to anybody. I ask you not to share it outside of your group. So the principal legislation, we have the UK GDPR that was transposed from European regulation, the Data Protection Act 2018. In terms of the regulation around personal data, that is governed by the UK Information Commissioner's Office. And then we also have PECA, Privacy and Electronic Communications Regulations. So I just wanted to touch, given that we're talking about cybersecurity here and from a personal data perspective, for the purposes of my discussion, the ICO's powers. So they have financial powers. And you've heard about the penalties. I'm sure all of you have heard about the extent of the penalties from an ICO perspective, regulatory enforcement. So they can fine anything up to 20 million euros or 4% of global annual turnover, whichever is greater. Now, there are two tiers to that in terms of financial penalties. It depends on the nature of the infringement itself. But they also have investigative powers. So the ICO can issue information notices to request specific information from organizations. They can ask us that they have assessment notices. And they also have something similar to like a dawn raid scenario. So you'll be able to, so the ICO will be able to issue a search warrant, for example, and be able to come into your offices, and they'll be able to extract any kind of material that they need for the purposes of their investigation effectively. And then we have, in terms of corrective powers as well. So this is where the ICO can issue warnings, for example, and also they can also ban your processing. So effective, not just temporarily, but permanently as well. So actually, you talk about 4% of global annual turnover, but banning your processing activities could mean switching your business off overnight. I mean, that's how catastrophic their powers can be, and how wide-ranging their powers can be. I've defined, I won't be talking too much legal, but just to provide a snapshot of what we're talking about when we're talking about a personal data breach. And I emphasize it being personal data breach because we talk about cybersecurity a lot, but to the extent that we're actually talking about where we've had an infringement from a personal data perspective, is where they've actually had access to unauthorized, unlawful access to individuals' personal information. So what does this mean for an organization? So if you're acting, and you've probably heard the definitions of a data controller or a data processor. So either the controller, so where they're responsible effectively for your data as an organization. So they will determine the means and the purposes of processing your information. A processor, on the other hand, will be accessing the information and acting under the instruction and processing that information on behalf of the controller. So if it's unlikely to result, if the breach is unlikely to result in a risk to the rights and freedoms of an individual, then as a controller, the key message here really is to just document the breach, the nature of the breach internally. So you've always got a record. So from a kind of self-accountability perspective, if you're ever asked from the ICO, you've got that ability to pull the record up and say, these are the actions that we took internally. If, for example, it's not unlikely to result, i.e. it could result in a risk to the rights of individuals, then documenting internally, but also there's a breach requirement notification that you have to report to the ICO within a very limited time frame, and that's 72 hours. And I can't stress the importance of that, because it's more around once you become aware of it. So the time starts ticking upon becoming aware of the breach. Now, if you're a processor, there's a slightly different notification requirement, and that's without undue delay. So as soon as you become aware of it, you've got to notify the controller of the breach without undue delay. It effectively means as soon as possible, but that's the term. We're not given any more. There's guidance from European Data Protection Board and in terms of how you would define that, but effectively it means as soon as you've on notice that there is a breach, you need to report that to the ICO. The time's already started ticking. So from a controller perspective, if you're told 48 hours in there's a breach, you've got to report it within the next 24. So it's not once the controller becomes aware, but it's once the processor is aware, the time starts ticking. And then, of course, if it's likely to result in a high risk to the rights and freedoms of an individual, not only do you have to document it internally, report it within 72 hours, you also have to notify the data subject. And again, without undue delay. So you've got multiple thresholds of reporting, and particularly as a controller, so the onus is on the controller, but there are now obligations on the data processor under GDPR as well. So enforcement activity, we've probably seen a lot of this in the press, and I think this was at the time when GDPR was coming into force. This was kind of 2018, 2019 periods where you saw the BA announcement, the enforcement, and that was effectively, I'll go into a bit more detail on that. That was where they had the British Airways site for logging details if you wanted to go and purchase a ticket. Someone had effectively overlaid the same interface, but it was obviously from a hacking perspective, they'd overlaid the interface to make it look and look like it was a British Airways website, but it wasn't. And in doing so, people have provided their login details. They then provided all their names, addresses, emails, bank account information, CVVs, you name it. It was on there, and it was going through the dark web, if you like to call it that. To 420,000 individuals were impacted in this case. So with the ICO's hat on under GDPR and the significant fines, they thought we're going to make an example of this to BA. So they immediately said, we're going to issue a fine of 187 million. In the end, it became only 20 million, but it's still a stark message to the industry that you've got to put more sufficient cybersecurity measures in place to mitigate the risk and avoid this from happening again. And they also had individual compensations as a result. So you're not just being enforced from a regulatory perspective with the fines, but also you've got the compensation claims from individuals as well. So it's a two-pronged approach. Moving on to the cases. So we've seen Lloyd and Google and a number of cases on there that we're highlighting in terms of recent activity. Lloyd and Google is an interesting one, and this is more around representative claims, so kind of touching on where the individuals have got their right to bring about a claim, not just the regulatory enforcement piece. And this was discussed at High Court. It then went to the Supreme Court, and it really touched on the fact that the facts of it were an individual, Lloyd, brought about a claim alleging that Google was tracking the activity of millions of individuals over a period of months. And this was through a Safari, because they couldn't support, they were trying to find a workaround from Safari iPhone usage to be able to facilitate something. And the crux of this case was really around how they didn't feel that damages were, that had to be proved. So Lloyd, I'm not explaining this very well. Lloyd was claiming that the damages didn't need to be proven. So what actual loss had actually had come out of this situation. So he was alleging something, but he had no proof that Google were actually performing this. against millions of people. And so in the end, the Supreme Court said, well, if you've got no proof, then how can you bring about damages? How can it meet the threshold of awarding damages effectively? So in a way, this is successful for the industry because it meant that litigation funders and lawyers were losses, but the individuals and controllers were the winners in this situation. And it really kind of closed the door in terms of opt-out representative claims, which I suppose is a success in that context, not for us lawyers, but but yeah, so that's kind of where the position is at the moment in terms of opt-out representation. And then just to highlight, we don't really know what direction the ICO is going in at the moment. So we've just had a new information commissioner appointed. So we're yet to hear in terms of strategy and enforcement from cyber attack perspective. But John Edwards is now appointed as the new information commissioner. He's serving a term of 5 years. And we'll watch this space in terms of how he approaches enforcement from a cyber attack perspective on organizations, and what his real priorities are and focus is. I'm yet to know, and I think we will start to learn more about what his objectives are. And then just very, very briefly, this kind of gives you an idea of the landscape of what we're dealing with from a data reforms perspective. So some have already been enacted, as you'll be aware, some are yet to be adopted. So we've got the Data Act, the Artificial Intelligence Act, Digital Services Act, Digital Markets Act, and then the Data Governance Act, which has recently been adopted. So there is so much regulation here, and it really is, and some of it are obviously upcoming, some subject to being finalised. But it just shows the nature of what we're dealing with in trying to manage cyber, not just cyber, but personal data, but all data, how we go about sharing data, how we can use data from an economy perspective so it can benefit the economy, how it can be used in a way that doesn't contravene with individual rights and freedoms. So there's a real fine line going on, but trying to regulate going forward. So yeah, and just in terms of our recent activity, just as Eleanor was talking about with nation state activity, we're seeing that within the organization. Actually, we're getting a lot of queries and issues in terms of, I suppose, state sponsored activities, and also state endorsed activities from Russia, and how really what can you do? You can't really prosecute Russia for doing that because it's too much of a threat if you were to do that. So I suppose the key things are making sure you've got firewalls in place, you're providing adequate penetration testing, vulnerability testing, you're up to date with your incident response plans. Yeah, so in a brief summmy, but
thank
yeah,
you, Jenna.
yeah.
That was brilliant. And well, you're going to have a job forever. That's all I can say. And I think actually you beautifully touched on what Flick is now going to cover, which is how do you work with companies so that they are set up for success, and they aren't going to be subjected to GDPR fines and ICO fines, which sound even worse in terms of stopping you doing business. Anyway, if we've got, there you are, Flick. Flick, so without further ado, over to you.
Wow, fantastic, and great to meet you all and great to see you all. What amazing discussions with Eleanor and Jenna. I was fascinated by them. And in fact, I'm going to go back to Eleanor's discussion and talk to you around something that we lovingly call cyber resilience. Now, there's a life cycle of everything. And in a cyber attack, we have protect, stop it getting in. And Eleanor knows that well, detect when it has got in, and respond when it does its nasty work, and ransomware. But there is also another one called recover. And this is when we have destructive cyber attacks, usually born out of ransomware. But I'm going to talk to you about a cyber attack called NotPetya. This came out of the Ukraine, as Eleanor said. It was written into the source code of a company that wrote an application called MeDocs. And if you basically did any business in the Ukraine, you had to download this piece of software to do your tax return. So 3,000 companies downloaded this. And they basically downloaded the software. 3,000 companies were infected, 650 companies admitted that they were infected. And I'll give you two numbers. Maersk lost 60,000 PCs and 8,000 servers in just under 12 minutes. And I know Andy Jones and had a coffee with him. I also have presented with Darryl Steen, the ex-CIO of Reckitt Benckiser. They lost 6,000 servers and 45,000 PCs in just under 7 minutes. So I have to look after, how do I keep the company functioning? How do I allow companies to maintain core purpose and integrity under duress? Now, where security and cybersecurity was born from was a lot of data theft and a lot of ransomware. So protect, detect, respond. But we're still seeing a lot of companies going, right, when you see a cyber attack, turn off the network ports, stop working, stop everybody using stuff. And actually, I've seen a hospital be switched off by the security department for 9 days because they were leaking to the dark web. So my job is twofold. One, when a nasty attack happens and there is true destruction and it happens very quickly, I have to keep that hospital functioning, that bank having access to money. And I also have to make sure that we can recover very, very quickly at basically the business risk appetite. A retailer will tell you their website needs to be back up and running in 5 minutes. Actually, when there's a cyber attack, everybody waits until the IT department has had a good look before they switch it all back on again. So how do we do it? Well, I suppose I liken, and the reason we get there is because security, and rightly so, do not do recover. They are very focused on data theft, absolutely right, GDPR, and also making sure they protect, detect, and respond, but it's a totally different skill set to recover. The cyber team can't do it. They have to revert to backups and DR, but the hackers, hey, they're a cunning lot. They then infect your backup and they infect your disaster recovery environment or any tertiary environment that you've got, unless you actually put certain technologies in play, which is fundamentally air gapping. So basically you can't get the virus to jump over. But the trouble is with technologies at the moment, we have different technologies like active, high availability and third copy to give you more resilience. Unfortunately, they are super spreader events. So I work alongside, I run security and resilience, and I have to make sure that we protect, detect, respond, and recognize that sometimes those people that are asking for a ransom don't recover your systems after you've paid. You know, they're not as honest as you would expect them to be, and that leaves companies absolutely paralyzed. Now, there's 3 things to consider. We have to look at actually the recovery time. And the recovery time can take, Reckitt Benckiser took 3 weeks to access their Commvault backup system only to find it was infected. So we know that they took weeks and weeks and weeks. Maersk, as we famously know, for those of you that know the story, tried to restore, and it took them about a day and a half to restore, where they all stood back and they all cheered and clapped only to watch the systems collapse again when they realized each of their backups was infected. So the recovery time can be absolutely excruciating. It can be a number of weeks. Then we have to look at reputation and brand. Merck, the pharmaceutical that got caught up in the same environment, and they were basically standing in the wrong place at the wrong time. This was not a targeted attack for each of these companies. They lost 890 million of their share price because of that nasty little attack. And the White House has already said that it cost the globe $10 billion in that overall attack. And then we also have to look at actually how many people it takes to overall do the recovery side of things. We call them a 0-day attack. So the world is actually changing in cybersecurity. And I know me and Eleanor are both absolutely passionate about this, to make sure that we don't just do protect, detect, respond and recover. And in fact, the European Central Bank Oversight Committee has already spoken about this and said it's now protect, detect, recover. Now, for me to recover correctly, I need to make sure every time I'm putting your data away, it's clean, right? But the problem is in the IT industry, and this is where you all start nodding. Let me ask all of you, when was the last time you tried to restore your personal data from backup just to check that backup was working effectively? Well, the answer probably is never, and you're just hoping that that's the case. And actually, some of you will say, actually, I don't know if I back it up or not with my own personal data. And we have the same situation in the industry. And I'll tell you for what. 31 years ago, for those of you that are roughly my age, and yes, I'm stinkingly old, you'll remember that the industry was towered. You see, we were all a bit of a hodgepodge mess before then. We used to write IT for sales and IT for procurement, and neither of the systems would ever work together. So Gartner came along and said, we'll tower you. Mainframe, mid-range, server, end user, desktop, network, applications, database, cloud, security, resilience. And we all sat in these wonderful towers and created this new foreign language. And 31 years later, we're institutionalized. You know, I'm a database administrator. Oh, I look after cloud. I look after servers. I do data center. I do security. I do resilience. And we love these towers. It makes sense. The world is logical. Except for when I say to a company, what critical processes do you need to run to maintain your core purpose and integrity? Think of a hospital, patient records. Or think of this call, looking at me now, your end user device has to work, your network has to work, the data center that's hosting the WebEx or Zoom application has to work, Zoom has to work itself. And so actually where we are so used to being in vertical technical towers, I have to look at the business process and say, what do I need to recover to make sure you can have access to patient records? And it's multiple towers run by multiple systems. I have to, of course, let's say it's running in Google. So we have to make sure we've got Google working and the servers and everything else working to make sure we can knit that process. So that's the biggest issue that we have in the industry at the moment, is this sort of looking at how we recover technical towers, but not how we recover business processes at the speed the business can afford or needs to. Because regardless of whether it's a ransomware attack or it's a destructive cyber attack, or actually if it's fat fingers or floods, fires, pandemics, actually we need to keep business processes running. So Eleanor does a fantastic job at making sure the NCSC recognises that end-to-end spectrum and give guidance and advice on things about zero trust and how you do security postures and how you protect. But then when it all goes a little bit wrong, what we have to do is, of course, make sure we are all hands to the pump to recover. However, if you then thought about the beginning of that life cycle, when you actually strategized how you sort of identify to set your strategy, all I have to do actually, which is really crazy, it's nice and simple, is make sure there's a mapping between business processes and technology. When you buy technology, you're setting the right standards and SLAs to make sure that's in line with your business risk appetite. And then all I've got to do is clean the data before I put it away, and put it away somewhere where the hackers can't touch it, and make sure I put some stuff around it so I can bring up a skeleton environment to keep the world functioning. So that's what I do. I find it, as you can tell, extremely exciting, because the whole security, cybersecurity, GDPR, identify, protect, detect, respond is fundamentally changing to make sure we protect those business processes, not those technology stacks. So thank you, Helen, for inviting me. And I think we're going to Sharon, I believe now.
Thank you, Flick. And I think you just made a really good, nice point there that, you know, reputational damage is by far and away the biggest cost, you know, outweighs any fine you're going to get from the ICO, I think. But anyway, thank you, Flick, for that. And now moving on to Sharon to talk about cyber safety.
Yes,
talk about our children.
Yeah, slightly different, but I suppose as you guys were talking, I was thinking, you know, it's bad people taking advantage of I suppose those more vulnerable. So my name is Sharon Pursey. I'm co-founder of SafeToNet and CEO of the SafeToNet Foundation, but I'm not a techie at all. I'm a mum of 4 and I'm passionate about keeping children safe online. I'm a huge fan of technology for children. When I compare to when I was growing up, to that of my kids, it's simply a joke now. We depended on Encyclopedia Britannica, and if it wasn't in that, you just gave up. My daughter taught herself piano on her iPhone, and I watched her research her A-levels online with envy, because in my day, if you couldn't work it out in the classroom, well, that was that. So let's talk about SafeToNet and our mission. At SafeToNet, our mission is to keep children safe online, period. We're all about impact. We're predominantly B2B, and we focus on real-time threat detection in live video stream. We use artificial intelligence to filter content online for children, and that is web browsing. We offer web well-being features for children and parents. And we also use app management tools where parents can switch on and off apps on their children's phones. Our consumer solution is Net Nanny, so that might be a brand you've heard of, and that helps parents monitor their children's devices safely. In Germany, we have a telco, which is called the SafeToNet family stores, and that's about 90 high street stores. And there you cannot buy a phone that doesn't have safety tech included. So it is safe out of the box. So let's talk about the problems of online harms against children. It is such a complex ecosystem because sadly, there are so many harms. Content online that causes harm to children. I mean, we hear about it every day: eating disorders, pornography, body image issues, too much screen time, cyberbullying, abuse. We call these lawful but awful. Then we have radicalisation and child sexual exploitation material, the illegal. Child sexual abuse material is the sexual abuse and exploitation of children. Not only do these images and videos document victims' exploitation and abuse, but when these files are shared across the internet, child victims suffer re-victimization each time the image and their sexual abuse is viewed. There is an organization in the US called NetMech, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. It has a cyber tip line, and it offers the public and online electronic service providers a way to report suspected incidences of sexual exploitation of children online. And I'm just going to give you some figures to give you an idea of just kind of the scale of the problem. In 2019, they have different categories, and this is the possession, manufacture, and distribution of child sexual exploitation material. There were 16.9 million reports. 2020, there was 21.66 million reports. And in 2021, 29.3 million reports in 1 year. According to the NCA's Director General, Dame Lynn Owens, this year's National Strategic Assessment shows how criminal exploitation of technology is central to the threat to the people in the UK. For law enforcement, the front line must now be online as well as on our streets. The assessment estimates that there will be between 550,000 and 850,000 people in the UK who pose varying forms of sexual risk to children, and they're just in the UK. We in the UK have an organisation called the Internet Watch Foundation. I don't know whether you've heard of them, but they are an amazing organisation, and they exist to hunt down and remove records of online abuse material. In 2021, I'm just going to give you two facts. The Internet Watch Foundation took action to remove a record-breaking 252,000 URLs, which it confirmed contained images or videos of children being raped and or suffering sexual abuse. Of these, the Internet Watch Foundation confirmed that 182,281 URLs contained images or videos of self-generated material. This is a 374% increase on pre-pandemic levels, when in 2019, analysts took action to remove 38,424 URLs containing self-generated material. So that is such a huge, children went home from school, they were learning online and also being abused by sexual predators. So let's talk about the difference between cybersecurity and cybersafety. I mean, it's quite obvious. Cybersecurity's core function is to protect the devices we all use, smartphones, laptops, tablets, and computers, and the services we access both online and at work from theft or damage. Cybersafety protects the people using those devices or services from harm by the devices and networks, and therefore third parties. So what solutions are there? There's a new evolving sector called safety tech. It's one of the fastest growing sectors in the UK, and it is full of amazing UK tech companies developing brilliant technology to retrofit safety into the ecosystem. So why has it been difficult to get traction with big tech platforms? Surely it's a no-brainer. Well, that's what I think. Big tech companies are commercially driven and very sensitive to customer experience friction. They depend on engagement, good or bad, and unfortunately, online harms are big business. These young safety tech companies, like us, need help to raise their profile. It's a sort of David and Goliath situation. We're developing the solutions that big tech companies said couldn't be done. With the inevitability of end-to-end encryption, there's a real risk that the reports currently going to NetMech will be rendered invisible by this encryption. This was over 20 million reports of child sexual abuse in 2021. In an attempt to accelerate pioneering solutions, DCMS funded us as one of 5 companies as part of a Safety Tech Challenge Fund to develop solutions that keep children safe within end-to-end encrypted environments, whilst respecting the end user privacy. Our solution is called SafeToWatch. SafeToWatch detects harm in real-time live video stream that is generated on the child's device before it enters the encrypted environment. This means it would be impossible for the child to be able to film themselves for the benefit of a sexual predator. So let's talk about legislation and why it's important. So we've built it. How do we get it to big tech and get them to implement it? That has been the real challenge for us. And it's why the legislation is so important to young companies like us. We don't think that the UK online safety bill is perfect, but we are pleased that it's coming to fruition after all. It's an extremely complex problem with so many harms. The legislation is designed to set out clear rules to help companies make sure that their users are safe. The harms can be both legal and illegal. So as I said, we call them lawful but awful. Platforms that allow children to share content will have a duty of care to report illegal harms to law enforcement. There's an independent regulator, Ofcom, who will oversee that all of this, and they will hold these companies to account. Let's hope they have the same teeth that the ICO have. Part of this bill is to encourage these platforms to embed tech that will make it easier for users to stay safe online. Thank goodness legislation is emerging in Australia, New Zealand, the US, EU, Japan, South Africa, and more. So in conclusion, sometimes I wonder, why are we even talking about this? This is such a no-brainer. Technology for children should be safe out of the box. Nothing in life is more important than family. Thanks.
Thank you, Sharon. Well, that's certainly given us food for thought. Let me come back to that because I just want to summarize what we've heard, a little bit of what we've heard, because there's a lot of what we heard, and then I'll open it up to questions. Yeah. So firstly, Eleanor was talking about the death of the spy on the bench, which has kind of upset me somewhat, but no more 007. But that cyber crime poses our greatest threat, and it's taking out individuals and SMEs. It represents 90% of the threat landscape. And interestingly, it all seems to be coming from Russia, which I think didn't used to be the case, but it seems to be Russia. And it's all about, you know, a hunt for dollars. They want to get our money, I guess. I learned a new term, detonate a ransomware attack. I guess I've never heard, didn't know you detonated ransomware attacks, but that actually makes complete sense. And the fact that our data is copied, you pay the ransom and then you get your data back. Otherwise it goes to the dark web, and it can affect anyone buying a house, paying bills, etc., which is somewhat alarming. Anyway, thank you, Ellen. I'm sure we'll have questions. Jenna talked about GDPR and the ICO, and that actually within 72 hours of knowing there's a breach, you have to report it. And actually the fines, we're talking about $20 million or 4% of annual turnover. But actually the ICO can actually ban you from processing, which actually can stop your business, which has far more dramatic impact. And talked about an interesting case involving Google and Lloyd, which was very interesting. And that they made an example of BA by fining them 20 million, I think it was. Flick talked about how do you keep companies going? How do you make sure that they're set up for success and to guard against cybersecurity issues, but also if they are subject to it, how do you get them going again? She talked about some of the nightmares of hospitals being down for 9 days. Reckitt Benckiser Kaiser took weeks to recover itself. Merck's share price dropped by nearly £1 billion. And then, of course, brought to the fore really the reputational damage that can be caused, let alone damage to your top line and bottom line through actually getting back online. And the fact that it is important for companies to have resilience and to have high availability and disaster recovery, but actually these can be super spreader events, which I thought was very interesting. And then Sharon really brought it very, 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 very much home for us and close to home. And she got me when she said she had 4 children. But anyway, moving on. And actually, I think it was quite important for Sharon to say she's not a techie, but was a big fan of tech for children, and talked about all the things that her business and her foundation are trying to do in terms of helping children stay safe online. And some of the statistics you quoted were quite alarming, Sharon. I think the NetMech reports 16.9 million reports of something horrible, sexual abuse online, which has increased to 29.3 million. And I think maybe a lot of us can see that, you know, the pandemic and lockdown has had a very negative effect on cyber safety for children. Anyway, right, without further ado, thank you, ladies. Really awesome. I am now going to open it up for questions. Juliet has a question.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
First of all, thank you so much for such an engaging session. You know, to watch and listen online at 6:30 without a glass of wine is remarkable. I really enjoyed each and every session, so thank you. My question is about the future, and we hear a lot about the metaverse. I'm wondering how each of your organizations are thinking about the different implications, cyber attacks that might come with the virtual world. I heard a stats last week where, for example, Sharon, you might be interested in this, girl avatars get 100% more online abuse. And the only remedy is to change your avatar to a man. You know, so there's going to be like a whole new set of dynamics that we haven't really thought about yet that I think are interesting, both from a legislation point of view, security, detection, threat and protection. So yeah, I think perhaps each and every one of you might have a perspective on how that's going to be adapted or reacted to in the future.
Sharon, do you want to start?
Yeah, I thought you were actually going to mention, Juliet, the fact that the metaverse are pretty much sure that they're going to implement end-to-end encryption across all the messaging platforms. And interestingly, that 29 million, most of those come from Facebook and Instagram. The majority do. And when the end-to-end encryption is deployed, that's going to turn the lights out. And there will be you won't be able to see the bad things happening to children, and those reports will not be looked into, and nothing's going to be done about those. That's scary. I'm part of a campaign that's funded by the Home Office and SACHI at the moment, and we're really struggling to get traction with that because of the challenges with, the benefits that end-to-end encryption brings. But the flip side of that is that it pulls a shroud over the conversation between a sexual predator and a child as well. So.
Hello, everybody. It's Annette Nabavi. I just wanted to know how many companies pay the ransom.
Yeah.
And whether that actually works.
That's a really good question. I think, Eleanor, are you there?
I'm here. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, we have another question for you, though.
I've heard the ransomware question and I'm determined to answer it. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, let me try before I lose connectivity. A distressingly large amount of companies are indeed paying the ransom, because when you are up against it and all your files have been encrypted and your data's been stolen and you have basically no option, the most rational choice for many companies is to go ahead and pay. And it is extremely worrying for the government, for me, for NCSE, and for the authorities that basically this ecosystem of incentivizing payment perpetuates the business model, because it works. It means that the criminals are getting the money they're trying to get and they will keep going. So it's a really difficult, vicious circle now of successful attacks resulting in successful payments and the ongoing threat. So it's something we are really, really worried about. And thank you for the question.
And does it work? Was the follow-on question.
According to a negotiation company whose professional job is to negotiate with the ransomware actors, so they have a vested interest, in 98% of cases, the actors stick to their word and they give you back your data and they give you the key to decrypt your files. But you have to take that with a pinch of salt. It's in their interest because they're a negotiation company. But I think you can sort of assume that for the business model to be sustainable, for the business model to work, for people they need to think that it's going to work, don't they? They need to think that if they pay the money, they will get what they're asking for.
Yes.
So in fact, it is self-perpetuating, and generally speaking, apart from the fringe, volatile new groups that might spring up that are not, not serious in ransomware terms, generally speaking, this is a model whereby, yes, it incentivizes you to pay the ransom and to keep doing so.
Okay, thank you, Eleanor. We have another question in the room.
My question's to Sharon. I've got two girls and it's an absolute nightmare with them being online, and like they play like all the games on Roblox and stuff like that. And whilst there's mechanisms in there, I know that like friends who have children of a similar age, they're not as technically savvy to be able to do the restrictions and make sure that they can only invite their friends and do those kinds of things. What advice would you give to like parents to say, these are the sorts of things? Because I think there's, as much as we're adults in work, when it comes to the things that our children are doing online, we're not quite so savvy.
I absolutely feel your pain. We shouldn't be in this situation, should we? These games should not be dangerous for children. So, in some ways, it makes me so angry that children and parents have got to take on this responsibility, because they shouldn't be happening. However, we are where we are. We've got lists of tips. Be cyber aware is the first one. You have got to get, if you've got to get into your child's world. If you're letting them play a game, then you've got to know what it is and you've got to set the restrictions. Otherwise, they shouldn't really be on it. And we're all guilty of being busy and doing whatever we're doing, and our children downloading apps and whatever. But I think you do have to keep on top of it. Otherwise, you don't know what they're doing. And not all children are the same. Some are more vulnerable than others. I think your own children and look for the signs. Make sure that they're not in their room with their phone, that there's that they're kind of in your sight, and then watch there if you feel that there's something up. You know, always kind of have those conversations with your children about what they're doing online and who they're speaking to, and you know what games they're playing. But I think it's very difficult for, I mean, I'm glad I've got mine up a bit because I think it's terrifying.
Good
Sorry,
question.
give you more advice than that. Immerse yourself.
Yeah, very good question. Thank you. I think we've got Bianca next, yeah?
Hi,
Bianca.
good evening. Thank you so much for all the insight. I'm kind of looking at it from more of a procurement perspective. If you're in a position where you're doing technology purchasing and you're building a strategy around buying in technology, how do you go about trying to ensure that when you're having to make, let's say, 50 to 100 purchasing decisions over a couple of months when buying technology, that those technology providers are actually safe and aren't going to put you at risk? Because it feels as though ultimately the buck kind of stops with procurement and compliance teams when bringing on board vendors to do the screening.
So, Bianca, who would you like to point that question at?
Anyone who might have any insight would be.
Let me see.
Yeah, how about Flick?
Perspective. Yeah.
Flick, do you want to have a go?
Yeah, I'll have a go. And hello, Bianca. Very good question. And I know that from a procurement point of view, you'll have your tick list for companies to say what they do in terms of security, but there are very, very few questionnaires on how they do backup or how they look after their disaster recovery environments. And a lot of companies sweat their assets. And that means their technology is older and is prone to more vulnerabilities. And the world is still not getting up to speed with a lot of things in IT, but certainly from making sure that your data is available, resilient and secure, and it hasn't got sort of bad things in it. So from a procurement point of view to check, I would validate not just their security stance and do a security audit, but also look at their resilience and their disaster recovery side of things as well, and what standards they adhere to. That's one angle. And the other angle, Bianca, is of course, when you're buying technologies, just make sure when you knit it all together, you haven't got any holes like Swiss cheese in your security strategy. So a lot of companies will say, yeah, we protect, or yeah, we do DR. But when you look under DR and look at the disaster recovery strategy they've got, it's never sufficient. So it's potentially what we do is we ask them to talk about how they'd react to certain scenarios. So how they would deal with certain outages, what would be their recovery strategies. Because of course, as you know from the DORA regulations, or Jenna certainly knows about DORA regulations coming down, it's all around making sure you've got operational resilience. And there are regulations coming out to make sure that technical service providers have to provide you information to make sure you know what they're doing and the support they have around their services to you. If that answers your question, Bianca.
Yeah. So for example, a little while ago, I was dealing with a project where we were moving infrastructure from in-house onto an AWS platform, and we had an intermediary consultancy helping us to do that. But then once you start looking at it and digging through it, then you say, okay, but how resilient is it actually? We've basically just got live replication happening. And how do you check that company, is there, for example, a set of criteria that you can go look at, or a set of requirements to ask the provider that's kind of running the intermediary? Because you kind of just go, okay, well, Gartner says you're great, so therefore crack on. Like, how does that?
I think Jenna has a point of view here.
Very quickly, I think ISO 27001, and I won't say any more than that, but just look at that certification. I think that's a really good checklist. I don't know, Flick, Eleanor, if you want to elaborate on that, but I think that's a really good starting point.
That's a very good start. DORA is another good start. Seymour from the Bank of England is a good start, but also 22003, which is the sort of recovery side of things as well. But I think from your point of view, Bianca, and I'm happy to talk to you offline and give you some ideas, but yeah, I think from your perspective, technology companies are all chosen, but no one's actually checked whether or not they're looking after their own IT okay. And that's why I am permanently employed in this area, because...
And I think testing as well, just looking at the policies, asked to see their breach management plans and response, that incident response plans. And, and if they say, oh, we haven't got a copy of that, then you kind of, it's a bit of a sense check, and you think, well, actually, if you haven't got a copy of it, perhaps you're not performing it.
Certainly,
it's sort of that ethical purchasing, isn't it? And we have a huge checklist that any supplier has to go through to prove themselves before we'll actually do business with them. So purely from that aspect.
Thank you.
I hope that answers your question, Bianca.
Thank you, Flick. I'm sorry. I'm just very sorry, Bianca. I'm going to cut you off because I'm just conscious of time. And I think we've got one more question. I think it's Lara. So Lara.
Yes. Hi, everybody.
Hi.
Lara Stoimanova here. I had a question. I mean, we talked about cyber attacks and ransomware on private companies, systems and laptops, but a lot of us work from home and we also use our personal devices. And I just wanted to understand, how big is the threat on personal devices and what can we do to protect our own personal laptops? That's the question.
Eleanor, do you want to jump in there?
I can have a try. Yeah, no worries. I mean, it's certainly true that when we all moved to working from home at the start of lockdown, that massively increased the threat surface. So a lot of that was with the corporate devices that suddenly all went home and logging in virtually from remote locations, remote desk protocol, open accesses, virtual machines. All of these things created opportunities for attackers that that made these issues worse during that period. In terms of personal devices, I think the threat is no greater perhaps than it was, but a lot of the same lessons do remain about protecting credentials, so credentials that might be at risk from phishing attacks and from spoofing and from the traditional fraud activities that you'll see. All of these will be ongoing, and whilst you're at home, you're probably more vulnerable to quite a lot of these kinds of attacks. So I think, protecting your personal data and taking extra care and being vigilant whilst working from home is probably the right thing to do. But corporately, organisations also need to be really careful about their IT estate and not just rush to get everyone home, but to bear in mind the security implications of doing so as well.
Thanks, Eleanor. Thank you. I'm conscious it's a school night, but thank you for joining our hybrid event. Even Sharon's cat joined us, so gorgeous kitty. But anyway, I just wanted to thank our 4 panelists. So we have, I'm trying to do it in order, Eleanor, Jenna, Flick and Sharon. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise. Brilliant.